Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by ServPro. Fun show on tap for you. You know, it seems only right if we're going to ask big questions about all the other SEC teams in the last few days. That is what we have been doing. If we're going to do that, we should also be willing to kind of turn the attention on Georgia and do the same thing for these Dogs. And today I'm going to give it to you what I believe the one big question for Georgia is, and why the way in which Kirby Smart answers that question, if it does get answered in this particular way, could go a long way in determining just how confident these Dogs are rolling into the 2025 season. We'll talk about that. Connor Riley stops by. A couple of different looks at the Georgia schedule here on the program today. And I'm going to give you one thing around college football I'm incredibly thankful for in the midst of a lot of other stuff I'm not so thrilled about. So we'll give that to you. It is all on the way. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
This is a pre-recorded show. I think you kind of already know that. Tomorrow, though, we will have a live portion. If you're a podcast listener, think of it as recorded live. That means for recruiting news, kind of a catch-up on some of that, we'll have Jeff Sintel, Kaylee Manziel, kind of a special edition to Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, kind of in our normal spot here on DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. So we'll do some of me giving way to them. And so if you want kind of immediate reaction to the news of the moment, we'll give that to you here coming up tomorrow. I think that's going to be good. Prior to that, though, let me talk about this. You know, one of the things we've been doing, kind of a theme warning for our cruise around the SEC near the end of our program, is one big question for each SEC team. We'll do more of that today. And it's, of course, only appropriate if we're going to do that for each SEC team ahead of SEC Media Days, by the way. We're coming up very close to that in the month of July, where all kinds of questions will be asked about all the SEC teams. If we're going to ask one of all the other SEC teams, we should also ask it of Georgia. And I'm going to kind of cheat on this just a bit, because if I did crowdsource this, open it up to everybody, I think we would get sort of a handful of ideas. You know, if you want to go back to what was being said a lot, January, February, boy, there was a lot of Mike Bobo talk at the time. I would say there's less of that than there used to be. Now, I don't know what that means necessarily. People are probably just excited about recruiting, or people just kind of get into a good mood as you kind of go through summer towards the fall. But if you notice there's just less of the Bobo stuff than there once was, I have noticed that. I don't know that I have a good explanation for why or what it means, but I have noticed it. But if I did open this up, hey, Georgia fans, in fact, on our live comment sections right now across all video platforms, I'm sure you're seeing some of this perhaps there. Georgia fans, what's your big question for Georgia? Mike Bobo stuff would come up in all of that. That's true. I think there would also be a bunch of questions about, like, say, Gunnar Stockton. And while I have downplayed, and I will continue to do so, the overall feelings that somehow Stockton is maybe, you know, sort of below the standard of what Georgia needs, we still are very much of the belief that Gunnar Stockton can be an outstanding quarterback for Georgia this year. In fact, I liked a lot of what I saw from Gunnar in the postseason, second half of the SEC championship. The college ball playoff game against Notre Dame, despite the fact it was not a Georgia win, I liked a lot of what I saw from Gunnar Stockton there, and believe that Gunnar is quite capable of doing the job for Georgia this year. But once again, fair to acknowledge that if you opened up Georgia fans to ask, what is, you know, the big question for Georgia, a good number of those questions would perhaps center around Gunnar Stockton. I believe that's true. I think there would be questions about the offensive line. We talked to John Stinchcomb about that yesterday. You'd have a lot of that going on as well. So if you listen to people say offensive line, or people say quarterback, or people say Mike Bobo, here's what it kind of all adds up to me. That one way or another, whether you're fixated on this or fixated on that or something different, one way or another, the big question for Georgia rests on the offensive side of the ball. It kind of all adds up to, with new quarterback and new receivers and the same coaching staff, is this offense going to be better than it was a year ago? That's sort of what the question is for Georgia. But I would then take it and kind of go a different way with it. That if we all kind of agree that the question for Georgia is on offense, whether it's the sub-question, offensive line, Stockton, Bobo, whatever, the question for Georgia is on offense. I think the more interesting question that comes from that is, how willing to acknowledge that is Kirby Smart going to be? Because when we hear from Kirby again at SEC Media Days, we're going to get kind of one of two versions of Kirby. Sometimes there's a version of Kirby that just doesn't want to play along, does not want to support the storyline, does not want to further the narrative. And if he doesn't want to answer your question, he's simply not going to, which is probably his prerogative, but sometimes that's the case. There are other moments, though, and this is, I would say, Kirby at his best and most interesting. There are other moments, though, that Kirby Smart, in anticipation of what the narrative is going to be, has an answer at the ready. And I do think it will be very compelling to see which of those versions of Kirby Smart shows up for SEC Media Days, which will be here in Atlanta in just a couple of weeks. He will get a lot of questions about the Georgia offense. Does he acknowledge the premise of those questions? And in somehow, by the way that he answers, does he acknowledge the need for improvement? Because if we take it back to 2022, this is after Georgia's first national championship, prior to the Go for Two in 22 season that resulted in back-to-back. Kirby Smart was more than happy to anticipate the narrative, to recognize the storyline, and for the big question that he was getting over and over and over again that year, at that particular time, he did have an answer at the ready. Will he do the same thing here again in 2025? Let's go back and hear him from a couple of years ago, prior to the 2022 season, when the big question was about, can you come back and do it again? Do you have the same hunger? Do you have the same desire? Let's hear how emphatically Smart answered that question then, to sort of set the stage for what he might do at this year's SEC Media Days. This is from summer of 2022.
I've been around, done the rounds this morning. I'll bet you at least 50 people have asked me the question. So feel free when we open up for questions to ask me the concern there is for complacency. That does not concern me in the least, because to be complacent, you have to have done something and achieved something. The men on this team for this season have not done that. They have not. We had 15 players that are now gone to NFL camps or draft picks. They're gone. And we have some returning players, but they're hungry as ever. People have asked the question, how does it feel to be hunted? We will not be hunted at the University of Georgia. I can promise you that. The hunting that we do will be done from us going the other direction. It's not something we're going to sit back and be passive about.
It's an all-time great line from Kirby Smart. It's sort of a great remark at SEC Media Days. It's one of those things that sort of lives forever. And he started that, the sort of less quotable, less memorable part of that. He says, I've done the rounds all day long. I've probably had 50 people ask me about being complacent and whether or not I'm concerned about that. Wouldn't it be interesting if Smart were to say the same thing this summer? Because if he does get the same question 50 times this summer at SEC Media Days, which is also once again in Atlanta like it was when he said what he said there, if he does get the same question 50 times this summer, it won't be about being complacent. It probably in some form or fashion will be about an offense that was in the spotlight, that had Paul Feinbaum saying all the stuff that he's been saying and other talking heads saying all the stuff they've been saying. That if he does get the same question 50 times this particular SEC Media Days, it's going to be about that. Is Kirby Smart as willing to take that topic on as he was the notion of complacency in 2022? If I'm being honest, we do have to acknowledge that in previous instances in the last few months, Kirby hasn't quite been as willing to take that topic head on. In fact, if you want to go to, like, say, the end of the Sugar Bowl when Georgia lost to Notre Dame, a game in which Georgia did not play great offensively. When Kirby Smart was asked about the fact that there were kind of a lot of those moments this year, whether it be offensive line or drops or whatever, just not a great year for the offense. Obviously, some fans wondering what role the guy you see on your screen, Mike Bobo, might have played into some of that. And I think there was a desire on the part of Georgia fans just to hear Kirby Smart give voice to those concerns and to speak as aggressively about that as he did about so-called complacency back in 2022. But at the Sugar Bowl in that post-game press conference, that's not exactly what Kirby Smart did. Let me give you a reminder.
Well, I attributed, number one, some really good defenses we played. I mean, that one was a really good defense. We have played some really good defenses. We've had a rotating a lineup with guys that have rolled in and out, and we haven't created the same thing on defense we've done in the past. If you go to years past defense, we created more turnovers, better third downs to get the ball back. There's a lot of things we can do better to help our offense, but we certainly have to play better and do better. A lot of that has to do with health and the schedule we play and having some playmakers that can make some plays too.
So if I'm being honest, that's not like the awesome version of Kirby that you got media days in 2022 when he looks straight at the camera and says, we're not going to be hunted at Georgia. We're going to be the hunters. Like that particular clip we just played, it's not quite as emphatic. It's not quite as quotable. And I would say that for many Georgia fans, it's nowhere near as satisfactory to hear Smart, when asked about the offense, blaming the defense. And also talks about the rotating cast of characters, basically meaning injuries. And then also saying, well, we've been playing some tough defenses. Given the fact that Georgia also plans on playing tough defenses here in 2025, that feels a little unsatisfying too. That's not quite taking the same issue as head on, as just confronting it, face to face, the way that Smart would have perhaps confronted other issues at previous media days. So that's my big question for Georgia. Not how good your offense is going to be, but how willing are you to acknowledge that your offense needs to be better than it was a year ago? And by the way, that's not playing the blame game. I'm not pointing at fingers at anything. I'm just saying the overall basic stat line, simple counting stats that we all understand, they need to be improved from where they were a year ago. You need a better rushing attack. You need fewer drops. You need more points scored. You need all of that however you get there. You need to do that. And I am very interested to see how much Smart acknowledges the prevalence of those questions, because if the media is free to ask whatever they want, those questions will be legion. Now, let me say one more thing about this to kind of close out this conversation. Here is something worth keeping in mind. If Smart does give you something at media days, similar to what he's given you in the past, if he does say something to the effect of, oh, I hope y'all ask me about this. 50 people have asked me about that. I hope all of you ask me about it too. Let me tell you what I think that speaks to. I think it speaks to a certain level of confidence. And you'll remember the other day on the show when Kirby was on with Feinbaum at what was that, spring meeting? We have a lot of meetings this time of year. Spring meetings in Destin, Florida, and Feinbaum had called out Gunnar Stockton on the show and said Georgia was going to be in trouble. And Kirby laughing, it was a joke, it was done for fun, but still on the show said, listen, I'm glad you said what you said. Gunnar Stockton heard you, and I'm glad he did. You're helping us, That was a confident version of Kirby. More than happy to take on that topic because he thought he had the facts on his side. He's more than happy to talk about his quarterback, Gunnar Stockton, laughing at Feinbaum's doubts because Kirby apparently, based on his tone during that discussion, did not share those doubts. So let's watch this at SEC Media Days here coming up. When we hear from Kirby, we know what the big narrative is going to be. People are going to be asking about the offense, whether it's the offense connected to your new quarterback or the offense connected to your old offensive coordinator or the offense connected to all the drops and all the whatever. We know the question about the offense. Kirby Smart's willingness to discuss that topic, I think, gives us an idea of how confident he is about that issue. If he's confident, that could be bad news for the rest of college football. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We are happy that you're here, whether it's normally live on video, today pre-recorded, That's all the platforms, Facebook, YouTube, world-famous DawgNation.com. We're also on the radio every day at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 Ref. We love doing that. And the thing we're probably most proud of is the fact that our podcast, now we're going on 10 years of doing our podcast. And we'll actually celebrate our 10th anniversary in August. I'm thinking about some big things to do as it relates to that. Really excited about that. And just, I mean, many of you have been here with us the entire time. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Many of you haven't been here all 10 years, but you've been with us for a good number of years. And that is such a cool thing for me. I really, really, really appreciate all of that. And I'm thankful to our friends at ServPro make it all possible here too. And listen, over the course of 10 years doing the show, we've had some mess we've had to clean up around here. In fact, by the way, one time in particular, going back to what, I guess it's 2 studios ago now, many of you know this, we had a big water issue there, water getting everywhere. And we called ServPro. They came, they cleaned it up. They got it all put back together like it never even happened. That's just simply what they do. They can do that for you too, whether it's the home you live in, maybe it's a rental property you have, you depend on that for passive income, you're funding your retirement that way, or you're trying to help pay for your kids' college. Listen, you got to take care of that. Property requires being taken care of. And there's all kinds of stuff. Fire, water pipes, weather-related catastrophe. There are just so many different ways for the property you have to be damaged. And I'm talking about like legitimate damage, like disastrous levels of damage. It doesn't take much, does it? You can put big-time damage together with what seems like sometimes sort of a small thing, but it can create huge damage. And when you find yourself in a messy situation like that, you want the restoration specialists of ServPro to kind of put it back together for you like it never even happened. That's what they're all about. And each franchise is independently owned and operated. That means you're doing business with someone who is just as invested in a satisfactory outcome for you as you are for yourself. I love that about ServPro. So find them online, servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com for more on that today. That's S-E-R-V, servpro.com. All right, great guest coming up here in a moment. Connor Riley going to stop by. We'll talk to Connor about his one big question for Georgia. We'll get into all that here in a moment. But prior to that, I do want to go around the dog house. And I'm going to do this kind of quick today because I want to save time for Connor Riley. But one of the things I was thinking about, and I guess as you get ready to kind of take a break from work, you perhaps get a little contemplative sometimes, or however you say that word. You start to contemplate a little bit. And one of the things I do contemplate a lot is I think many of us are kind of the same way. We can't help but be a little aggravated about the current state of affairs with college athletics. And when that kind of stuff happens, we're going to reserve the right to say so, whether it be the way in which we make the college football playoff way more complicated than it needs to be, the way in which chaos, I think, has been intentionally imposed on college athletics to sort of bring about frustration. Stuff like that happens, and it just drives us crazy, and we talk about it. However, I always want to be mindful of, from a realistic, kind of sort of fact-based standpoint, that I don't want it to only be the negative stuff, because, it's very easy, and you can go on social media and you just sort of see this with your own eyes, is that there's a motivation to sort of spew negativity that doesn't quite exist for the positive. People are far more motivated to leave a negative review for some company than they are a positive review. When you're angry about a politician or a celebrity or whatever, you go on social media, you sort of fire off some sort of message. It's just easier to do that than sometimes the positive. But, there's also positive things that are worth noticing. So as we're around the doghouse here today, let me say to you, I believe, one positive thing that I think I have undeniably noticed that is undoubtedly better about the current landscape of college football brought about by some of the changes we're experiencing. I would say it's related to the games we get to see Georgia play, and frankly, the games we get to see everybody play. It wasn't all that long ago that you might go many weeks without seeing a real, true, big game for Georgia or one of the teams that Georgia's playing. Many of us experienced like a home schedule for Georgia throughout the years where it's like, and by the way, oftentimes the games themselves, once you got here, were actually bigger in real life than they appeared to be on paper. Sometimes that happens, but still, sometimes, we get so excited about college football and any college football game, sort of a good college football game, but it sort of feels like at times we're sort of missing the big college football game. That's no longer true, is it? I mean, when you look at the regular season schedule that Georgia is playing, I mean, isn't it about as, sort of rich with storyline as anything you've ever seen? And we've been through this and chronicled this so much, whether it be at Tennessee or hosting Alabama or, seeing Texas coming in as an SEC team for the first time, playing Tech at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, for various reasons. And a lot of this is related to the two new schools in the SEC. There are just a larger number of more interesting games in the Georgia schedule we've ever seen before. And for as convoluted as they've turned this college football postseason into, and as much as we worry about the sort of hindered growth of the playoff eventually really kind of messing up the regular season, it's still pretty good. And the fact that, we saw Georgia play Notre Dame a year ago, you could see Georgia play who knows who this year if it gets in. We've seen Georgia beat Ohio State. We've seen Georgia beat Michigan. Prior to those games in 2021, 2022, y'all, I mean, it'd been decades, half a century, or not quite half a century for Ohio State, but half a century for Georgia and Michigan, early 90s for Georgia and Ohio State. But now in this new landscape, this stuff happens now with regularity. And I do think we should appreciate that there's a lot of change coming to college football that we don't love. And it's not change for the better. And we're not going to be afraid to sort of call that out when it occurs. But we don't want to do just the negative stuff. We want to also recognize the good as well. And here we are, kind of midpoint of the summer, rolling towards the start of the 2025 season. And I'll tell you, in my soul, in my bones, I'm just as excited about college football as I've ever been. I really am. And it's the games we'll see Georgia play and the wins we hope to see them get that are a big reason why on that. And I just wanted to take a minute to appreciate that here as we are around the doghouse. Now, before we bring on Connor Riley, let me also get ready to do this. I want to give a shout out to our friends at Daytona Beach for just a moment because, as I mentioned before, we're kind of halfway point of the summer. So many of you getting away from work, kids are out of school. Also, as you get to this point in the summer, a lot of your baseball and your sports have kind of come to an end. It seems like you kind of get a little bit of a break with that. Well, now you're kind of thinking about, let's go to the beach. Let's get somewhere. This is a great time to go to Daytona Beach. Last minute hotel deals, things like that. You could find some of that if you haven't already booked your summer vacation. In fact, if you've never been to Daytona Beach before and you're a little late in the game here, this might be a great time to go because, Daytona's got lots of really wonderful hotel and resort options. So if you've missed your chance to get somewhere, we think you can find a great opportunity to stay somewhere here at Daytona Beach. And I'll tell you this, and you all know this, I grew up going to Daytona Beach. Some of my best childhood memories are tied to Daytona Beach, and I love the fact that new memories are still being made every single day right there at Daytona Beach. There's an international airport. You can fly there. There's 23 miles of shoreline. Of course, you know it for motorsports. But it's not the only thing happening there at Daytona Beach. In fact, it's time for you to find out for yourself. So check them out online. DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. That's DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals for a great deal on a fun stay at Daytona Beach today. All right, good stuff there. We'll continue to ask big questions about the rest of the SEC before our show is done today. But for now, on all the other things happening around Georgia, let's talk to Connor Riley here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
What is kind of a vacation week for me. Always a great chance on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro, to speak to Connor Riley, who's kind enough to sort of share some time with us in anticipation of this week. Connor, really appreciate that. And I hope on the week in which this is taking place, hope everything is going well. Probably not ideal to have so much recruiting stuff kind of playing out, but honestly, there's never an easy time to step away necessarily. So we'll certainly trust that everything as far as DawgNation coverage is going smoothly while all of this plays out. It's not exactly the dead of summer, though, right now with all of this news unfolding, right?
No, this is a change in the college football calendar. And I think with that July 1st date being as important as ever now, with that sort of being the start of the unofficial league year in college football, And this is something we're going to see more and more, and we're going to have to make decisions moving forward. Like, are we going to take time off during what figures to be a very, very busy time of year?
The answer to that question for me will continue to be yes. But nonetheless, I say that, of course, kiddingly. We're going to kind of ignore a lot of that here right now and talk about something completely different for a moment. In fact, I want to do this way, if you don't mind. I would say that in various times throughout, the spring and summer, when you're kind of far removed from the actual games, a lot of stuff sort of pops up on the radar that can be a little annoying and kind of aggravating. And honestly, I do reserve the right to sort of call out things I don't like. However, I was thinking about this, kind of as we get closer to the start of the upcoming season, which is there is one thing about the new landscape of college football and what we've seen kind of play out the last couple of years. There is one thing about the new landscape about college football that I think is undeniably better than the college football that I grew up with. Would you like to try to take a guess as to what that might be? One thing that I don't think there's any doubt about, this is better now than at any point in time in my lifetime. Would you like to guess what it is?
Is it Georgia's home schedule for 2025?
Basically, the yes, specifically that, but also just broadly speaking, there are just more good games than there used to be. There just are. And some of that's the postseason. Some of that, as you said, is the regular season. Last year, it was sort of the bucket list trips. You're going to Austin, Texas, for instance, playing the high-profile game at Alabama, which is obviously really challenging. But nonetheless, you're playing these big, road trip type games. This year, a lot of those were return dates back here at home. I just think it's appropriate while we have some time to stop and appreciate. For someone like me who's loved college football my entire life, there have never been more good games on my favorite team's schedule and just on the schedule overall than what we have here right now. For all the change that college football has wrought in our lives, to me, this is a change that is unquestionably for the better. Do you agree?
I'm old enough to remember when we would write these off-season storylines and things that people are saying, and it was always Heather Dinich raising concerns about Georgia's schedule and the way that it would look come the season, especially in the years like they didn't have a Clemson or an Oregon as a marquee non-conference game. Those days are so far gone with the way that this new SEC schedule sets up. And like, this is what it's going to be in a year in, year out basis. I don't think Georgia, because of the brand, because of the draw that they have, I don't think they're ever going to get like an Ole Miss or a Missouri type schedule where they just get so many of the lesser teams in this league. And so I think that's a big reason why you want to see Georgia, I think, remain at 8 conference games, because the idea of taking off a Marshall, an Austin P, and adding in a Texas A&M and Oklahoma, whoever that might be, well, it's great for fans. That makes winning those games all the more harder. And so be careful what you wish for in that regard. But this year is just, it's something where, especially like if they're able to win early, because this is something you and I have talked about, the longer you're able to put off that first loss, like that game against Texas, you think of the great home atmospheres under Kirby Smart at Georgia. That Texas game at the end of the season, if they're able to get through that early stretch of the schedule and they've got 1 or fewer losses on November 15th, that's going to be an all-time day, not just within Athens, but I think in college football as a whole, with what those two teams mean and what that game is going to mean in Sanford Stadium.
Yeah, and to me, and we've talked about it so much before, it's like this is the thing about college football that I really crave. That obviously I have been lucky enough to see national championships in 2021 and 2022, and I'm thankful to say, I was at the stadium, I was on the field after the game. Like, I got as close to that as you can be without actually being one of the coaches and players in the game. Like, that was a real bucket list experience for me. But it's the week-to-week grind of college football that is what college football actually is for me. And for instance, like say beating Tennessee in 2022 was just as significant as some of these postseason wins that Georgia's gotten as well, even though it was technically kind of only a regular season win. And if Georgia compiles like some of these regular season wins this year, it'll be just as laudatory as anything else that might happen in the postseason. Last year being in Austin and seeing Georgia beat Texas, that felt about as good as anything could feel. And if Georgia beats Alabama this year, or if it beats Texas again, or, it is college football is just a week-to-week sport. And when I think about the sport, that is what I think about. For as great as the championships are, it's what happens during the season that I think that kind of defines the way we feel about a season in many ways.
It's the journey over the destination. And so much, of college sports, as it becomes more professionalized, becomes about winning a national championship and getting there at the end of the year. But don't let that eschew from the fact that the ride there can be just as much fun and just as interesting as important. You think back to that 2021 team, that big opening season victory against Clemson. And then, obviously the end of the year, they lose to Alabama. And that month leading up to the national championship, where yes, they beat Michigan and then they got a rematch against Alabama, I think is so important to the way we contextualize and the way we remember that 2021 national championship team. Whereas if, as we get further removed from it, you see the talent on that team, it'll always sort of seem like it was fait accompli that they were going to win a national title. Being in the day-to-day, the week-to-week, that was very much not the case. And even that 2022 team a year later, that Tennessee game, the Ohio State games, the road game against Kentucky in the freezing cold, those week-to-weeks, as you're in it, I think that that's something that should be rewarded and should be remembered, and frankly should be celebrated a little bit more. Whereas, again, as college football continues to look more and more like a professional sport, there starts to become, I think, a hyper fixation on the end result. And I think that takes away from what makes the college season so special.
So we talk about how great the regular season schedule is for Georgia, the home games in particular, but let me kind of move to the postseason here for a moment. And I'm putting you in the spot. You're not prepared for this, but I think you'll give an interesting answer anyway. Who's the most interesting team that Georgia could play in this year's postseason as far as you're concerned?
Texas obviously jumps to mind with the way that this program has been talked about. I think Ohio State, as they try to go back to back, I think could be interesting as well, with Ryan Day trying to wrangle things maybe away from Kirby Smart and be someone that can get that second title there. If Georgia can play Clemson this year, I'm super fascinated by how that would turn out. We saw Georgia and Clemson play at the beginning of the 2024 season. Georgia ran away with that game and really dominated Clemson. But since then, even though Clemson, lost to every SEC team they played last year, it seems like that program seems to be, from a national media standpoint, on an upward trajectory, whereas I think the national media on a whole is a good bit lower than Georgia. But if those two teams meet in December, they meet in one of the first four games in that quarterfinal round, I think that Georgia might be favored in that game, to the surprise of many, given that Clemson team is going to run through just a very poor ACC. And if Georgia's able to win that game, even if this is a team that doesn't win the national championship, and I don't know if this is a team that can, but if you're able to say that Georgia's able to win a quarterfinal game against Clemson and get to the semifinals, in my mind, that is a great season, because I think that not only shows that Georgia is able to, even in a down year, grind through a Clemson team that is on an upward trajectory, it puts further distance in my mind between Kirby Smart and Dabo Swinney, who are right now, in my mind, the two top coaches in college football just based on what they've done. And so if Georgia's able to do that, they're able to pick off Clemson. I think that is a very big thing moving forward, especially as Clemson and Georgia match up for more recruits than not moving forward.
I think Clemson is maybe the most interesting team in the country to me, sort of outside the SEC, which is obviously what I care most about, just simply because I think there are a lot of people who thought that Clemson kind of was done. And I think I probably maybe thought the same thing after Georgia beat them 34-3 last year, that it was just sort of a Clemson team kind of trending away from the national elite category. But it really seems like they've changed that, and they've done that in a way that Dabo Swinney teams have in the past. Cade Klubnik right now ranks as among the, on paper anyway, best quarterbacks in America. The best Dabo Swinney teams usually have elite quarterback play. I think there are people who believe that Klubnik can be that for Clemson. So I do think it would be interesting just sort of see where Clemson fits in the playoff story, because I believe this is a bit of a plot twist from where some people thought the Clemson thing was going. But let me give you a different team to consider here just for a moment. And it's a game that I hope that Georgia can avoid. I think there are a lot of people that would love to see Georgia play Miami, and I just want to be done with that. Miami needs to win a game of note to even have a chance of doing something like this. But, I think there's going to be some wishful thinking on the part of some, because Carson Beck was the most high-profile transfer, and that Miami was at least on the fringe of being a playoff team a year ago, that somehow this could all work out, and Beck and Miami could be playing against Georgia, which is certainly possible if Georgia's not one of the the top seeded teams or something, maybe that somehow this could work out. And I'm here for rematch against some of these SEC teams, although I'd like to avoid it. I'd certainly like to see Georgia get a rematch against Notre Dame, anybody from the Big Ten, because of the hot topic that's been thus far this offseason. I personally would just sort of like to avoid Miami if possible, just because I'm sort of bored by the regurgitation of the Beck. I don't like making enemies out of former Georgia players, but it is at least a possibility that could also occur.
Georgia fans, and I understand why. I understand there's a fascination. I understand there's a frustration with the way that last season unfolded. I don't think Carson handled it in the best way that he could, and I don't think necessarily Georgia put Carson in the best position last year. But this fixation that still continues to exist with Carson back is just, quite frankly, I think beneath Georgia fans. Like, you should be more than happy with Gunnar Stockton. You should be more than happy with your program moving forward. And I understand that this is going to be something that's going to come up anytime Carson Beck says something about Georgia, which I'm sure is going to be a topic at ACC Media Days. That first game of the year against Notre Dame, lone spotlight on a Sunday night, there are going to be a lot of Georgia fans watching that game. There are going to be a lot of people drawing conclusions from that game, especially what happens if Gunnar Stockton struggles for the first time. Carson Beck is a Miami Hurricane. You should treat him like you should treat any Miami Hurricane quarterback at this point in time moving forward. And while, yes, there is the Georgia connection there, the fixation on Beck and everything that has happened in the months since he elected to leave Georgia, I just do not believe is a good look for the Georgia fan base as a whole. And seeing him in a game, I think would be very nasty for all parties involved, and would probably bring out, at least in my opinion, the worst in college football and some of the trash talking and things. And I know that's some of the fun of it, but at a certain point, I feel like the Beck stuff crossed a line of no return. And if Georgia were to play Miami, it would be such a massive talking point. National media people would be weighing in, and it just would be a very unfun week leading up to the game. And then regardless of what happens there, I do agree that is a game from a narrative standpoint. I just don't care to see Georgia play in.
Yeah, I think unfun is the right way to describe that for sure. All right, the time we have left, let me kind of shift to something else. One of the things we're doing this week is a little bit of a theme related to some of our SEC preview stuff with SEC Media Days here in Atlanta kind of looming a little closer than perhaps people realize, midpoint in July. We're looking at kind of some of the big questions facing each of these SEC teams, so it seems fair we would also do this for Georgia too. So if you could ask one question right now, broadly speaking, of Georgia, whether it be to Kirby Smart or about the team overall, what in your mind is sort of the big question as it relates to Georgia here right now?
I'm acting under the idea that, I've got Veritasium and Kirby Smart can give me the total truth, which is absolutely never going to happen. But if we get an honest answer, for me, this defensive front, specifically the defensive line, how ready do you think they are for that first month of the season where they got to go to Tennessee on the road and then they got to play an Alabama team that has talent on that offensive line? Because Georgia's best teams have always had elite or dominant, if not entire defensive linemen in waves, at least one or two guys that can make a difference. And early on, I'm hesitant to say that Georgia has that. Maybe Christian Miller is that, and he comes out and is a monster from the beginning of the season. Maybe Jordan Hall validates the hype. Gabe Harris is someone who I'm super high on. It's a very young Georgia defensive line. It's a defensive line that I believe in, and over the course of the season, I think they're going to get better, provided that they stay healthy and don't have to rely on 2-3 guys like they did at the beginning of last season. But early on, how this defensive line plays and how dominant and how great they potentially are, I think is going to go a long way in determining how Georgia gets through that first stretch of schedule where they go at Tennessee, home Alabama, home Kentucky, at Auburn. If you're able to get through those games 4-0, you're feeling fantastic about what you're able to accomplish. And the defensive line, I think, is going to just be a massive, massive key for that team early on in the season. I think they sort of epitomize what this team is in 2025. It is a very talented team. However, it is also a very young and unproven team. And I'm just curious to get an honest assessment of how he feels about that group.
And just to follow up real quickly, I think honest is an interesting word to use here. Not that Smart's going to lie necessarily, but sometimes Smart is more willing to kind of, I guess, embrace the narrative than others. There have been some years in SEC Media Days where he's totally acknowledged kind of the so-called elephant in the room or whatever. There are other times in which, Smart does not want to play along with whatever he believes the storyline is. If there is a storyline right now, it's a team that perhaps didn't achieve everything a year ago that it could. How much do you think Smart is willing to acknowledge that when we hear from him again during SEC Media Days?
I think a good bit. I think he has spoken before about just how difficult last season was on the whole. And some of that, I think, is dealing with the turnover and the roster churn that comes with the transfer portal and recruiting guys who you thought in the past might be around for 3-4 years. And now because of the transfer portal, you're just not getting the same level of buy-in, the same level of commitment. And so I think they've done a better job specifically with that 2024 recruiting class of getting guys who are committed to being at Georgia for the long haul. And as more and more of those guys make up those recruiting classes and get Georgia, I think, to a more stable standpoint, they're going to help with that. But that was very much not the case a season ago. And there was just a lot going on off the field for Georgia. Right now, as we sit here, we're recording this at the end of June. This is airing in the middle of July. It has been a much quieter offseason for Georgia, and I think that is something that Kirby Smart and company very much welcome.
I think it's a really good point. Connor, great stuff. We appreciate that. We'll look forward to reading plenty from you. And, of course, we appreciate your coverage while I am away, and we'll talk to you very soon here again on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Really enjoy that conversation with Connor Riley. Interesting stuff. And I do think that, as we said, one of the things that college football has clearly improved in is the scheduling overall. And we have a ton of problems with the college football playoff. That's obviously really frustrating. I think some of the behavior of the committee is almost inexplicable. But even that creates matchups we just didn't used to get. Did not used to get the level of fascinating matchups we know we'll see via the regular season, have a chance to see via the postseason, and you certainly can't forget about that. And both John Monday, Connor today, have also both kind of had questions, or I should say interesting responses to my question about what their one big question for Georgia would be in the spirit of SEC Media Days on the way, and in the spirit of the fact that we're asking that about each of the other SEC teams as a part of Cruising Around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And speaking of Cruising Around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC right now. And, of course, when you're thinking about a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, for me, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about those ships that sail to Perfect Day Coco Cay. And this is one of the reasons why I think a travel advisor like Jessica Slater is so great for you if you haven't done this before. Like if you've never been on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation before, I think the experience of planning one can be, I don't want to say overwhelming, that's probably overstating it, but it can certainly be challenging because there's so much to think about. What ship do you want to sail on? What ports do you want to visit? What embarkation port do you want to leave from? And when do you want to go? There are a great number of variables, and someone like Jessica Slater can just sort of help you out with all of that. And I've been on a good number of cruises with Jessica as it is, so she and I happen to be on the same ship at the same time. So I know she's been on a lot of cruises because I've seen her personally on a lot of cruises. So you can trust someone who really knows the product and knows the experience, and she can tell you about how you can get to Perfect Day Coco Cay and all of the great things that go on with that. So give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, let's go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean right now. And let's talk about one big question and this is, we kind of started on Friday with like the sort of the lower teams in the SEC. Yesterday did the middle of the pack type teams. And now we're going to get to sort of the behemoths. These are the teams that for the most part have the best odds making the college football playoff, of course, minus Georgia, who we talk about the rest of the show. Just some of the bigger, more well-known storylines in the SEC for the upcoming year. In fact, let's start with Texas. And you may have heard this by now. Texas has a brand new starting quarterback. It is Arch Manning. I say that sarcastically. That's all anyone seems to be able to talk about here these days. But are you with me in saying that the real story for Texas this year may be what Texas has around Arch Manning? And I am of the belief that Manning is probably a good quarterback. Now, is he an all-time great? Is he remembered in the same category of others in the SEC? That remains to be seen, and I'm always going to be a little skeptical of someone being an all-time great because that's sort of a rare occurrence. But is he good enough to lead Texas to great success? I believe he certainly could be. But it's, as I said, it's kind of what's going on around him that's going to be interesting. The emergence of, Ryan Wingo as a true playmaker. And when you look at Texas a year ago, I think it's somewhat commendable. They had the success they had, given – do you remember before the season began, fall camp, big-time running back injury, C.J. Baxter, the most notable, goes down with an injury. And Texas, with its running game, essentially had to reinvent itself after that. Well, Baxter comes back, a guy that sort of stepped in place of him, Wisner at running back. He is also back too. And so one of the things that may kind of make Texas, now this is an offensive line that's also going to try to be feeling some stuff out here too. They're replacing some guys on that offensive line. But really what's going to make Texas, if it's preseason number 1 and competing for the national championship and actually, giving that a game effort, it's actually what happens around Arch Manning that may be just as interesting as anything else. Moving on to another team, kind of just slightly to the east. Let's look at the Alabama Crimson Tide here for a moment. And I think what's interesting is Kalen DeBoer and how well Kalen DeBoer is capable of handling the pressure that he's about to face, because at no point in time in his career has he experienced anything like what he's about to deal with. This is a guy who has won. And didn't have a terrible year 1 at Alabama. They went 9-3, could have made the playoff. But when you're replacing Nick Saban with a fan base like Alabama, that might as well have been winless. It might as well have been abject failure and total disaster for a guy who could have stayed out west if he wanted to and playing for national championship at Washington, winning what they were at the time, Pac-12 conference title. That's kind of a big deal. You come here, the expectations are just far larger. And he's probably in a more comfortable spot this year than he was a year ago, because he's been here for a year now, but also because he's got his offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, now back in place. This is the coaching staff that he wanted to work with. But pressure changes a man. It does. And, we have talked about that already, with the way in which we just watch turnover in the SEC on a fairly regular basis. And I think we're heading towards an off season and, moving towards 2026, where there could be even more of this on the way. Seeing how DeBoer handles that pressure going to be the most interesting thing about Alabama. Moving on from there, we'll talk about the LSU Fighting Tigers here for a moment. And speaking of pressure, there is probably a degree of pressure on Brian Kelly too. Now, Kelly has done some things at LSU, most notably helped produce a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. But in a roundabout way, that sort of speaks to what Kelly has not been able to do and what Kelly also steps into. A little bit different than the all-time great like Nick Saban, although in a roundabout way, this also relates to Nick Saban. The 3 previous head coaches at LSU prior to Kelly all won national championships. Ed Orgeron coached one of the greatest teams of all time in 2019. Les Miles rode the wild wave in 2007. And then Nick Saban, in the early days of his head coaching time in the SEC, won one in 2003. Brian Kelly came to LSU because that's what he wanted to do. And I would say in the first couple of years on the job, there may have been a little trouble kind of figuring out the transfer portal, knowing when to pull the trigger on a big spend, spending money on the wrong guys. It seems like this offseason, that process for LSU has been a lot more buttoned up. And with a veteran quarterback like Garrett Nussmeier returning, LSU is a good team and by almost anybody's estimation, a championship contender. But what you do wonder about is whether or not they just sort of get caught up in the numbers game that is the SEC, because for as much as they've done to put themselves in contention this offseason, they're still sort of only one of the teams you mentioned in the overall SEC discussion. And they could be just sort of lost in the shuffle if they're not careful. They've got a great chance to prove very early in the year what they're all about. Week 1 against Clemson, that's a team that we think is also a major playoff contender among the very best outside the SEC. If LSU is for real, that game against Clemson would be a great time to show it. Now let's talk about a couple of others here real quick. Let's talk about Florida for a moment. And, so much happens over the course of a calendar year in the SEC. We almost forget that late last season, the decision to bring Billy Napier back as Florida coach was controversial. And we were certainly led to believe, based on, reporting on the scene at the time, that Florida's decision to bring back Napier was kind of mitigated by promises that he would give up play calling and that he would relinquish some of the control that he had over the Florida offense. And in the subsequent weeks and months, It didn't quite seem like that happened, to be honest. It seems like whatever the original thought was, the actual plan put into place in the aftermath of that was a little bit different. This is a Florida team that in many ways, I would say, is someone who's kind of a couple hundred miles away looking in on it, still feels very similar to what it was a year ago. But there was also promise from, winning streak to end the season, the emergence of DJ Lagway as a quarterback that seems to have potentially a very bright future. I think all of a sudden the idea of bringing back Billy Napier doesn't quite seem as controversial as it once did. But boy, it won't take much to the tune of a couple of losses to kind of bring back all those old feelings up again and going back and kind of relitigating the decision to bring back Napier from a year ago. Here's the one thing that I do think factors into this. Florida did win the basketball national championship, and that's not nothing. Maybe Florida fans are in a slightly better mood now than they would have been before. I think it certainly puts Scott Strickland on firmer footing than he would have been, the Florida athletic director. But if that's true, maybe that gives him a little more freedom to make whatever he feels like the right decision is with Napier without putting his own job into question. In other words, if you like soap opera drama in the SEC, we do. If you especially like it with a hated rival like Florida, we may get some before this fall is done. That won't necessarily be a bad thing at all. And then finally, let's talk about the South Carolina Gamecocks. The one big question for them, do they have the SEC's best tandem? I believe they probably do. I think it is reasonable to say the best offensive and defensive combination in the SEC rests at South Carolina with Dylan Stewart, who had an amazing freshman season coming out the edge, and Lenora Sellers, a guy who has really probably emerged as one of the top quarterbacks, not just in the SEC, but the entire country. There was the rumor that he got $8 million NIL offer. The actual truth is it's probably a 2-year deal, about $4 million per, which is not really all that far out of line from what a lot of quarterbacks seem to be getting these days. Either way, this has to be the most optimistic the South Carolina fan base has been in forever. Steve Spurrier, certainly you'd have to go back to that era. Perhaps even, the answer may also be never. Never can also be a legitimate answer to this too, and maybe that's what that is for the Gamecocks. I'll say the same thing about South Carolina today I said about Tennessee a year ago. The next step in the development as your program is a doozy. To go from being a team that was legitimately good to now being a legitimate contender, boy, it takes a big step to get there. But honestly, the vibes around the Gamecocks are pretty good right now. So we'll be watching it closely. SEC Media Days very soon, and then the season after that. And for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And normally on a Tuesday for us, it's the former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. We'll kind of get back to our regular rhythm with Jake here coming up again very soon. But who knows? Maybe you'll also get a chance to hear from Jake at a different time this week. Sometimes we'll also do that for you, too. Either way, we love having guys like Jake Fromm on our program each and every day. We're proud of some of those great memories that Jake had playing against those lousy, stinking Gators, memories that have been building for us for a very long time. We take a great sense of pride in Georgia's dominance over Florida, and we celebrate it at the end of every show. We mock them normally with a golden shoe. We always do our Gator Hater Updater. In fact, we'll remind you, it's been 1,697 days since Florida's beaten Georgia in football. We hope to see that number keep on climbing. By the time we get to this October when the game is played, it'll be as long as it's been in forever for Georgia. History being made with that, and we certainly appreciate all that, and we appreciate you being with us here again today. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that, getting your AC tuned up, taking care of your plumbing emergencies, whatever it might be. R.S. Andrews does all of that for you. So let me give you the sort of reminder again that this is the last day of like sort of a fully pre-recorded show. Tomorrow, it'll be partially live. What's the old thing the NBC Olympics used to say, plausibly live? Well, we actually be more than plausibly live tomorrow. I'll do a little bit off the top, and then we'll give way to Jeff Sentell for a live edition of Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. I know y'all always give Jeff grief because he doesn't take comments like I do. No one's more interactive than me. Let's just say that. But maybe Jeff Sentell takes some comments for you tomorrow. I'm sure he'll be looking forward to that. And at the very least, and maybe most important of all, definitely most important of all, plenty of good recruiting talk from Jeff Sintel, because I know this. We're coming off a period of time where all kinds of announcements are being made. I have my guess as to how some of those might go, but I don't know for sure. Jeff Sintel does, because we're kind of in the moment on this. That's one of the reasons we're going to have live stuff for you tomorrow to catch you up on all the recruiting news that you've been missing. So we're going to do a lot of that with Jeff tomorrow. You'll love that. For now, though, let me say thank you for being a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate the great partnership that R.S. Andrews has had with us for such a long time. The one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You have a plumbing emergency, you have some sort of electrical issue, they're on the spot to take care of that for you, because after all, the RS stands for rapid service. They're about all of that. But this time of year, you're also thinking about those air conditioning issues. And if you've got problems with that, our friends at RS Andrews can take care of you, then get you tuned back up to factory fresh specs. That's what they do. So find them online today, rsandrews.com. That is rsandrews.com. All right, y'all have a great day. We're back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.